Part 1, pages 5 through 21 of textbook. What is a license? A license is a personal privilege to use the land of another. A license is not considered a true interest in the land because it can be taken away at any time and does not transfer with title. Examples of a license would include being able to park your car in a garage or having a ticket to the movie theater. A license can be created with a spoken or oral agreement, like giving someone permission to fish in your lake. You are now getting your real estate license. Let's not forget why it's called a real estate license. Real refers to real property, and estate has to do with duration of ownership. The or and ee rule. The suffix or is used for the person who performs an action. The suffix ee is used for the recipient of that action. In real estate, you will hear words like grantor, grantee, lessor, lessee, vendor, vendee, optioner, optionee, truster, trustee, mortgager, mortgagee, offerer, offeree. The list goes on. The gist of it is the or gives and the ee receives. A nice sentence to repeat to yourself and help remember this is grant or, less or, option or, vendor makes for the give or of the proprietor of your pleaser. So if you can see words like give, convey, sell, these require an or. Try saying this phrase out loud. Grantee, lessee, optionee, vendee gives me property, which makes me happy. So if you see words like receive, purchase, or acquire, you know these are likely to correspond to terms ending in E. It may sound silly, but when you are taking your exam and you see a question that you do not understand, but you know one party is giving something and the other party is receiving something, you can let yourself get a little excited. This is something difficult for some to get their head around, but with practice, you should have no trouble with these kinds of issues. For example, a vendor sells to a vendee. The grantor conveys property to a grantee who receives it. There may be a question which leads to who conveys property. You see an option that says grantor and another that says grantee. You may not know anything about deeds, but you know the answer is grantor because or refers to the conveyor. People often get confused with a mortgager and a mortgagee because they do not understand why the mortgager is the or and when the borrower is the person receiving the money. What you need to remember is that it all depends on what is being received and what is being borrowed. The buyer is pledging the property, so he or she is mortgaging the property and is known as mortgager. The lender receives their pledge and therefore is the mortgagee. Property ownership. Basics. Bundle of rights. The bundle of rights are the rights that come with property ownership. There are various rights or interests connected to the property ownership. An interest is a privilege and or legal share. When something is owed to a person by claim or legal guarantee, it is considered a right. Property ownership is also subjected to the rights or interests of others. The bundle of rights includes the right to use, give away, sell, mortgage, lease, rent, enter, refuse to exercise any of these rights. The bundle of rights is an accepted way to explain what is involved in owning property. Teachers often use this concept as a way to look at difficult information regarding owning property. The bundle of rights is usually taught to explain how many parties can have an interest in the property, as owning land is not as simple as buying property and acquiring all the rights to it. Think of it like this. In hockey, you have 6 players on the ice, 5 plus a goalie. Each player is like a right. When a player gets a penalty, he must come off the ice. When the player is done serving the penalty, the team returns to full strength. But theoretically, if every player was penalized, there would be no team left and it would be game over. Let's relate this to real estate. A mechanic's lien is a penalty. You will lose one of your rights, just as if you lose a player in the hockey game. Until the penalty has been released, releasing that lien gives you back those rights or players, and they rejoin the bundle held by the owner. In the United States and under common law, the fullest possible title to real estate is called fee simple absolute, but there are always some restrictions or encumbrance on property. Even the U.S. federal government's ownership of land is restricted in some ways by state property laws. Real versus personal property. Real property incorporates all things attached to the land and all rights inherent with that land. Real property usually involves things that are immovable, such as homes and buildings. This is not always the case, as there are examples of things that are movable and considered real property. However, as a general rule to help pass your exam, remember, real equals immovable. When you think of real estate, you think of homes and buildings. Remember, the word real has to do with the things that are immovable. The word estate has to do with the duration of ownership. That is why you are getting a real estate license. Person property involves things that are generally movable. This can include items like furniture, jewelry, clothing art, and other household goods. On your exam, you may hear personal property referred to as chattels or personality. To help you remember this, think of the word cattle. Cattle sounds like shadows. Cows like to moo, so chattels are movable property. It may sound ridiculous, but when chattels come up in your exam, you may be relieved at the thought of those mooing cows. Severance is changing an item from real property to personal property by detaching it from the land. Annexation is adding property by attaching an item to the property, so attaching personal property to real property. This creates a fixture. Annexation can often also mean attaching a smaller piece of land to a larger one. Also, a smaller document may be annexed to a larger one, such as a codicil to a will. Although physical joining is implied, actual contact is not always necessary. In the law of real property, annexation is used to describe the manner in which a chattel is joined to property. For example, a sink becomes a fixture when it is annexed to the plumbing outlet and is therefore real property. Fixtures. One of the ways to remember the difference between personal property and real property is that personal property goes with the person and real property goes with the real estate. A fixture is personal property that becomes real property. This means that it was something that went with the person, but for it now goes with the real estate that is being sold. The classic example of a fixture would be a chandelier, as it is an item that was movable but is now attached to a property. Other examples might be a sink or a toilet. To remember this, remember the name Maria. Can anybody say that name without singing the song by Blondie? Why should you be thinking about that song when they ask you about a fixture in your exam? Because Maria stands for method, adaptability, relationship, intention, agreement. Method of attachment. Is the item permanently affixed to the wall, ceiling, or flooring using nails, glue, cement, pipes, wires, or screws? Even if you can easily remove it, the method used to attach it might make it a fixture. For example, ceiling lights, although attached by wires that can be removed, the lights are a fixture. Adaptability. If the item becomes an integral part of the home, it cannot be removed. For example, a pool covering is a fixture because that cover goes with that pool, even though it can be easily folded up and put away. Relationship of the parties. If there is a dispute between buyer and seller, the buyer is likely to win. If the dispute is between tenant and landlord, the tenant is likely to win. This comes up in exams when dealing with the emblements. These are crops grown on land that is being rented. Intention of party when the item was attached. When the installation took place, was the intention to make a permanent attachment? If so, the item is a fixture. Agreement between the parties. Read your purchase contract. Most contain a clause that expressly defines and agrees on items included in the sale. They often refer to all existing fixtures and fittings that are attached to the property. Remember, what two people agree upon would trump all others' rules about fixture. Trade fixture. A trade fixture is a piece of equipment on or attached to the real estate which is used in a trade or business. Trade fixtures are different from other fixtures because they may be removed from the real estate, making it personal property even if attached at the end of the business tenancy, while ordinary fixtures attached to the real estate become part of the real estate. The business tenant must compensate the owner for any damages due to removal of trade fixtures or else repair the damage. It is important that you remember trade fixtures remain the tenant's property, so they are personal property. An example of this might be a display case used by a clothing store or a dentist chair. The dentist chair would be a trade fixture, as the chair is being used for the dentist's business. Even though it is attached to the property, the dentist will take that chair with him when he moves to a different location. Appurtenance. Appurtenance is a term for what belongs to and goes with something else. The appurtenance is always less important than what it belongs to. The word comes from the Latin appertenere, to appertain. Appurtenance is something which belongs to something else. It can be attached or not. It could be a barn to a house or an easement to land. The appurtenance is a part of the property and passes with it upon sale or other transfer. Encroachment. When you think of the word encroachment, you might think of somebody stepping over a line from their side onto yours. For all of you football fans out there, think of all those times when a defensive team goes over the neutral line before the ball is snapped up. In real estate, it is not all that different. An encroachment is when a structure or improvement on one person's land physically intrudes on the land of another person. Examples might also include a fence or driveway which crosses property line. Remember, your property line extends upwards to the sky, so a tree hanging over your property is also an encroachment. An encroachment can be found by a survey. Encroachment is a form of trespass, so when an encroachment occurs, you may be able to sue your neighbor for trespass. Emblements. Emblements are annual crops which have been legally cultivated and belong to the tenant. The tenant has an implied right to its harvest, so emblements are treated as the tenant's property. They are considered personal property. A tenant farmer has the right to his crops even after his lease ends until the end of the growing season. Crops grown on property just before it's sold are generally also considered the personal property of the seller. Remember that personal property goes with the person. This comes into play in the law of landlord and tenant, or in the foreclosure of mortgages and other legal situations that place the rights of another party in conflict with those of a farmer who has planted a crop which has not yet been harvested. In these situations, the doctrine of emoluments operates to guarantee the farmer's rights to harvest the fruits of his labor, even if he loses title to the land on which they are grown. Water rights. No one has title to water. Property owners whose land is next to bodies of water have a reasonable right to the use of the water, but that water is not theirs, so there are limits on what you can do with that water. Riparian rights allow a property owner to use water from moving waters such as river streams or creeks. Littoral rights concern properties next to an ocean, sea, or lake rather than a river or stream. Littoral rights are used to do with the use and enjoyment of the shore. An easy way to remember this is that riparian rights have to do with water that is moving in one direction, and littoral rights have to do with water that does not have a direction. Think riparian equals river, littoral equals lake. Repeat this to yourself and you should remember. Correlative use allows a property owner and the use of underground water or water from a river for irrigation. In states where water is scarce, the doctrine of prior appropriation determines the use of the water. According to this doctrine, the use of the water is determined by the state, not the owner whose property is next to the body of water. Accretion happens when the soil is brought by the water and increases the size of the property. When water moves back and new land is acquired, this is called reliction. Erosion is when land or soil is worn away by wind, water, currents, or ice. If natural causes tear away land in a violent way, this is called avulsion. A dam breaking or an earthquake is an example of avulsion. Estates. Freehold estates. A freehold estate is an estate where you have exclusion rights to enjoy the possessions of a property for an indefinite period of time. In contrast, a less than freehold estate is for a fixed, defined period. These three types of freehold estates that come up on real estate exam are fee simple absolute, fee simple defeasible, life estate. Fee simple absolute. A fee simple or a fee simple absolute is an estate in land. This type of ownership cannot be claimed by the previous owner or the previous owner's heirs. However, it is not free from encumbrances. Fee simple absolute is the greatest interest in a parcel of land that you can possibly own. Sometimes it is simply called fee. It is the most common way of owning real estate in common law countries, and is usually the most complete ownership interest that can be had in real property, except for absolute title. Fee simple ownership is absolute ownership of real property and is only limited by four basic government powers of taxation, eminent domain, police power, and SG. It could also be limited by some encumbrances or a condition in the deed. You do not really need a memory technique to remember this as long as you remember what the word absolute means. It means complete and unrestricted. Fee simple defeasible. A defeasible estate is created when a grantor puts a condition on a fee simple estate. In the deed, this means that if a particular event happens, the estate could be lost. Two types of the feasible estates are the fee simple determinable and the fee simple subject to a condition subsequent. The grantor may state a specific duration, such as, I grant this to A as long as the land is used for a park. Or, when the specific event happens, the estate will automatically end and go back to the grantor or the grantor's estate. This is called a fee simple determinable. The grantor may may state a specific condition such as no alcohol to be served. This would be a condition subsequent. You could lose title if you serve alcohol. Life estate. A life estate is an interest in real property which lasts the duration of one's personal lifetime. This may be the lifetime of the person holding the estate, or it may be the lifetime of another person. For example, Anne can give a property to Dan for the life of Anne. Dan would be the life tenant. A life tenant receives the property and is responsible for maintenance of the property and paying taxes. If a life tenant allows a property to deteriorate, it would be committing waste, and life tenant cannot commit waste. A life tenant cannot leave a property to someone in their will. A life tenant may sell, mortgage, or lease the property for the duration of the estate. So any contrast would end upon the death of the life tenant. For example, if Dan dies, the property were to go back to Anne. Anne would have the estate in reversion. If Anne dies, then the property would not be Dan's because he had it as long as Anne was alive. Or on Anne's death, the property would go to Lisa. Then Lisa would have the estate remainder. Less than freehold estate. A less than freehold estate is an estate held by someone who rents or leases properties. It is also known as a leasehold estate. The key element of a less than freehold estate is the limitation of time. Lease is a legal estate, so a leasehold estate can be bought and sold upon the market. A less than freehold estate could be an estate for years, periodic tenancy, estate at will, or estate at suffering. Estate for years. An estate for years is a leasehold interest in land for a fixed period of time. It is often called a tenancy for years. An example of an estate for years would be a summer rental, as it has a definite beginning and end date. There is no need to give notice at the end of the rental. So a lease for 6 months would be an estate for years, and a lease with a specific beginning and end date would be an estate for years as well. Periodic tenancy. Periodic tenancy is also known as an estate from years to years. It is a tenancy that is not bound to a lease with a fixed period, like an estate for years. A periodic tenancy follows a period such as a month to month, week to week, or year to year. To end the lease, proper notice must be given. Estate at sufferance. An estate at sufferance happens when the tenant wrongfully holds on to a property after his lease has ended. This is often called as tenancy at sufferance. An example of an estate at sufferance would be a tenant that does not pay rent. In simple terms, the landlord is suffering. This is not a form of trespass, as at one point the tenant did have the right to be on the property. The landlord would have to legally evict the tenant in this situation. Estate at will. Estate at will means that it can be ended at any time. It all depends on the will of both parties. An estate at will gives the lessee the right to possession until the estate is terminated by either party. The term of this estate is indefinite. This is not allowed in many states. Lease. In a lease, the landlord is the lessor and the tenant is the lessee. Oral or spoken leases can be binding. Generally, however, leases are written and give exclusive possession of the property to the lessee with a reversionary right to the lessor. A reversionary right means the owner has the right to take back possession of the property after the lease has expired. Just like in any other contract, a valid lease must contain mutual agreement, consideration, capable parties, and lawful object. The lessee has the right to quiet enjoyment and the possession of the property, which means that their possession will not be disturbed by anybody with superior title, the landlord. The lease is a bilateral contract because both the landlord and the tenant have obligations. The lease agreement can restrict the way the tenant uses the property and give certain conditions regarding the security deposit and the duration of the rental. Death does not usually end the lease. If one of the parties dies, the responsibilities stated in the agreement could pass on to the heirs of the deceased. Generally, when a property is sold to the new owner has the honor to the lease. However, this isn't always the case. Leases are personal property, as they do not always run with the land. It is a contract with an individual person. Unless the lease forbids it, the tenant has the right to sublet or assign the property. An assignment is a transfer of contract rights, unlike a sublet, where you rent the property and lease it to another person and still have a responsibility to your landlord under rental agreement. Construction eviction is a term used in property law to describe a situation where landlord either does something or fails to do something that he has a legal duty to do. An example might be if landlord refuses to provide heat or water to the apartment, as a tenant cannot live without water, so the tenant vacates the premise. This would be constructive eviction. Property management. A property manager has a fiduciary relationship with the owner. The main goal of the property manager are to generate the highest net income while maintaining the value of the property. A property manager is a general agent of the owner because they are engaged in an ongoing business relationship. Most states recognize property management contracts as personal services contracts that would end upon death of either party. Most states require property management agreements to be in writing. A property manager may be paid according to the gross or net income of the property that the property produces. The duties of a property manager include preparing the budget, allocating the money for fixed expenses, operating expenses, and reserve funds, selecting quality tenants, which involves being familiar with the market rent versus the contract rent, and offering concessions to attract tenants. The lease agreement should say when the rent is due. If the lease does not give a date, rent is due the last day of the leasing period. The property manager should maintain good relationships with the tenants. The duties of maintaining the property include hiring contractors or employees and overseeing their work. The property manager must keep funds for capital expenditure like remodeling and renovating the property. A property manager should have knowledge of the following: market conditions, record keepings, expenses, how to handle environmental hazards, and risk management. Risk management involves judging whether insurance is needed to protect the owner and manager from certain risks such as loss of revenue, liability from injury of anyone on the premise, loss due to fire, medical coverage for employees, and casualty losses. The four options of a property manager has for avoiding risk are: avoid the risk by removing the problem, deal with the risk by purchasing insurance with a large deductible, control the risk by installing protective equipment, or transfer the risk by obtaining insurance with no deductible. Types of leases. There are different types of leases that come up on your exam. Gross lease. A gross lease is a rental agreement where the tenant pays a fixed amount which never changes as a result of changes in the various expenses of the property. The landlord pays for these expenses, which might include repairs, taxes, and operating expenses. It is the opposite of a net lease, where these costs are covered by the lessee. Percentage lease. A percentage lease is a rental that is based on percentage of the monthly or annual gross sales made on the premises. Percentage leases are common with large retail stores, especially in shopping centers. A fundamental concept of the percentage lease is that both the landlord and the tenant should share in the advantages of the location. There are many types of percentage leases. The straight percentage of gross income without minimum, which is uncommon. The fixed minimum rent plus a percentage of the gross. The fixed minimum rent against a percentage of the gross, whichever is the greater amount. And the fixed minimum rent plus a percentage of the gross, with a ceiling to the percentage rental. There are also others. Net lease. A net lease is where the lessee has the responsibility to pay taxes, insurance, and maintenance, as well as the monthly lease payments. This is often referred to as triple net lease. Lease option. A lease option is a rental agreement where the tenant has an option to buy the property during the term or at the end of the lease. Here, the owner of the property would be the optioner. The tenant would be the optionee. Consideration is given to the optioner to secure the option for the optionee. The consideration can be monthly payments, or it can be money upfront towards a down payment on an already established amount. If the optionee exercises the option, title would revert back to the time the contract began, not when the option was exercised. Easements. An easement is when one person has the right to use the land of another for a specific purpose, such as access to the property. An easement runs with the land, meaning that when the property is sold, the right transfers to the new owner. You will often hear two terms when dealing with easements: ingress, which means to enter, and egress, which means to exit. Easements must be in writing. An appurtenant easement involves two properties owned by two different owners. The two properties involved are called dominant and servant. If you are not sure about who is who, just think about what the two words mean. Dominant means they are dominating, so they are in charge. Servient means they are serving, so therefore the servant is serving another person. So the dominant tenant is walking all over the servient tenement. This may be confusing sometimes, as the dominant tenement's property is usually smaller than the servant tenement's property. But hey, Napoleon was a small guy, and he always seems to dominate. Express easement. In many ways, the express easement is the best way to create easement. There are two ways to create an express easement. Creating an express easement, express grant. An express easement created by an express grant is given by the servient estate to the dominant estate. This type of express easement is usually bought and bargained for. For example, one neighbor may want to build a parking pad or basketball court off of their driveway. but may not have enough room on their lot to do so because the driveway already butts up against the property line. This owner may offer to pay her neighbor $500 for his consent to grant an express easement to build a parking pad at basketball court off of her driveway that extends over his land by 10 feet. Express reservation. An express easement created by express reservation is when the owner of one large piece of land splits the land into two or more pieces. She places an easement on one or more pieces of land to allow access to the other parcels. For example, imagine a farmer who owns 40 acres of land. The eastern side of his land borders the best lake in the state. So he decides that he is ready to give up his rusty old tractor and sell his land to a developer for $100 million so he can spend the rest of his days fishing. The only problem is that the farmer's home, which he spent 10 years building with his own two hands, has every intention of living in until his final days, is on the far west side of the 40-acre property. The only way to get to the lake is by driving over the eastern half of the property. The farmer may expressly reserve an easement at the time when the property is split into several parts, allowing him to cross the newly established property to the east of his homestead in order to reach the lake. Here, he has created an express reservation.